Is this check even real? The teller mumbled into the air, his tone sharp and hollow all at once. His eyes did not meet hers. Instead, they stayed locked on the slip of paper between his fingers like it had suddenly exploded suspicion. He quietly scoffed, then placed it under a scanner, tapped some keys harder than necessary, and exhaled. Almost theatrical. He leaned back in his chair, flicked his badge floating on his chest, and added something only the customer in front of him could hear. There's a lot of fraud these days. We have to be careful, especially with amounts like this. Beside him, his colleague raised her brow and whispered something under her breath. Neither woman nor man looked up. Across the counter, the woman holding the other half of the moment stood still. Have you ever been judged before you even opened your mouth? Based solely on what you wore? Your skin? Your age? The way you carried your quiet? If so, or if you believe discrimination has no place in this world, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because you will feel every word of what happened to Geraldine Mays. Geraldine, 72, had come to deposit her late husband's final pension check. It was a modest sum by many people's standards, just over $3,000. More than enough to help her replace the battered heater in her home and pay for the medication her insurance refused to fully cover. She wasn't poor, but she'd been careful her whole life because making dollars stretch was a skill she'd inherited, not one she had chosen. She didn't walk into the bank with loud clothes or luxury bags. Her coat was long wool and deep plum, the kind passed down from mother to daughter with care. Her purse was from a small boutique she loved 3 towns over. Her gloves were pressed neatly behind her folded check and ID. She walked with grace, slow but proud. She knew that bank well. Metropolitan United Branch number 216. Crisp white facade with loyal tellers and a lonely row of gray chairs along the left wall. She remembered when they first built this one. It wasn't too far from the bus route she used to take to work. Back then, she had stood in line with her husband's paycheck in hand, one hand holding a sleepy toddler, the other holding dignity. Now, decades later, she returned to the same corridor, this time with silence. She smiled gently as she stepped up to the counter. The teller, a young man with impatient eyes and overly gelled hair, barely acknowledged her. His fingers snapped toward the check before she handed it over completely. That's when it began. The frown, the exaggerated pause, the sigh of disbelief, like the amount she was depositing shouldn't belong in the hands of someone like her without explanation. He didn't ask her how her day was going. He didn't greet her with warmth. He only asked where she got the check and what it was for, layered with the polite sharpness that makes it sound like procedure but feels a lot more like prejudice. He studied the check like it carried a story needing to be unraveled, and a story, according to him, that didn't look right. Geraldine answered softly. She told him her husband passed 7 months ago. She said it was the last payout from his pension. Mr. Clarence Mays, she had added out of habit, unsure if anyone cared. She slid over her state-issued senior ID, the original death certificate, the benefit letter, and a second photo ID, because experience taught her being black and elderly meant being asked for proof of identity twice instead of once. He didn't thank her. He didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he held the check up to the light with a kind of drama that belonged in crime shows. He shook his head once without reason, glanced toward a coworker in the next window, then beckoned. Not for help, but for backup. The quietness around Geraldine deepened. Other customers began to notice. Some glanced up from their phones. A few frowned, sensing discomfort. An elderly man standing near the deposit slips grew still as he watched the teller's face contort with something between annoyance and accusation. Still, Geraldine didn't raise her voice. She had been taught long ago that raising one's voice rarely ends with justice, only faster exits. So she did what she always did. She breathed. She folded her hands atop her purse. And she waited. Within minutes, another woman approached. A supervisor, perhaps mid-30s with tired eyes, who glanced at the check and said something like, "This doesn't add up." She didn't introduce herself, nor did she acknowledge the stack of documentation Geraldine had laid so perfectly in front of her. And then it happened. The ripping sound was clean, intentional, like someone tearing open a letter that never belonged to them. The supervisor's hands moved quickly, tearing the check in two as if it was forged, fake, useless. And just like that, the final trace of her husband's steady work, his railroad nights, his rain-soaked boots on concrete, the birthday cards he never forgot to buy, was split down the middle beneath fluorescent light. She handed back the halves without emotion. "Unfortunately, we cannot accept this," the supervisor had said. "Too many red flags." Red flags. Geraldine blinked slowly. She took the pieces, folded them carefully as if they were silk, and put them into the side pocket of her purse. The rest of the room stayed murmuring, and the buzz of discomfort thickened like humidity before a storm. The teller rolled his chair back, already finished, already somewhere else. The supervisor waved to the next person in line like nothing had happened. But something had. Not anger, and not an outburst. A shift. Geraldine pressed her lips together. Then she slowly looked around the bank. Not at the people but at the walls. Her eyes floated across the branches branded Pride. Thick banners bearing shiny slogans, pastel posters of everyday heroes, and one wall-sized image that made her chest pause. A young woman, radiant smile, crisp navy suit, curls pinned neatly, stood tall against a marble background. "Faces of Metropolitan," it read in gold. Below it, "Confidence, class, commitment, meet the women leading us forward." Geraldine knew that face, and soon so would the world. The pieces of the check felt heavier than paper. Geraldine could feel them warming in her coat pocket, as if her husband's signature still carried a pulse. Now crumpled, now disrespected, but not erased. She walked slowly past the teller line. Her shoulders remained upright, her steps steady, though the muscles behind her knees wanted to give out. Not because she was weak. She was tired. Tired of moments like these. Tired of always being checked, questioned, watched. Tired of being surprised by something she should have seen coming, yet hoped she wouldn't face today. The silence in the room was strange. No yelling, no real confrontation, but everyone could feel it. The smell of something wrong lingered, even though no one named it. Back at the counter, the teller and supervisor whispered. Geraldine could hear pieces float through the air. Routine, verification, these kinds of checks. It was the kind of language people used when they wanted to feel professional while doing something terribly personal. She sat down in one of the waiting chairs, her handbag on her lap, her back pressed straight against the plastic frame. She wasn't planning to stay, but she also wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. She needed time to breathe without others deciding what she was supposed to feel. Across the hall, a young woman in a blazer approached the teller counter. She asked what just happened, motioning toward Geraldine with concern in her voice. But without giving too much attention, the supervisor waved her off, using that tone that ends conversations without permission. The young woman stepped aside but didn't walk away. Something in Geraldine's poise had caught her attention. The unforgiving buzz of the security scanner kicked on at the front door. A guard now stood near the lobby's edge, watching Geraldine closely. He didn't say anything. He just stood with folded arms, near enough to be noticed, but not near enough to call it intimidation outright. Geraldine knew what it meant. The measure always matched the perceived threat. And if you looked like her, old, black, tired but still standing, the threat was simply existing too confidently in places where quiet suffering was expected. She checked her watch. Minutes had passed. No one had apologized. No one had even asked if she was all right. The pieces of the check remained folded beside her good gloves, next to the breath mint she saved for her bus ride home. Behind the counter, more movement. Managers walked past briskly, but no one approached her. The incident already had a label now in their system. Suspicious attempt to deposit fraudulent check. That box had been ticked. The humanity taken out of it coded into corporate language. No room for the word widow. No space for dignity. Just protocol. A woman near the customer service desk had begun to record bits of the scene on her phone, careful to keep her screen discreet but pointed. Geraldine didn't notice immediately, but others did. Whispers floated across the room. Fingers pointed, but only softly, cautiously. Eyes danced between disbelief and discomfort. Two teenage boys who had been laughing on their phones in a far corner suddenly grew quiet. One of them squinted at the check that had been thrown away earlier and picked it up from the side bin. He noticed the crisp details, the embossed watermark, the pension logo, the neatly printed name, Clarence Mays. He didn't toss it back. He held on to it tight. Meanwhile, back behind the counter, the supervisor's demeanor had shifted. She noticed the others watching. The way the room had changed. The kind of silence that doesn't protect you, it points to you. A hidden cord of tension was now out in the open. Someone whispered, "That was her husband's last check." Another said, "I saw her ID. It matched." Then another, with uncertainty but care, "Isn't her daughter someone?" And still, through all of it, Geraldine said nothing. She sat the same way she had in churches and hospital waiting rooms and buses across town. Still, patient, dignified even in sorrow. She wasn't here to perform. She didn't need an audience. But now she had one anyway. Across the room, a child tugged at her mother's hand, asking why the old lady looked sad. The woman hushed her child but glanced in Geraldine's direction. And when their eyes met, just briefly, Geraldine gave her a small nod. Not anger, not defense, just certainty. Because something inside her had hardened in the last 10 minutes. Not bitterness. No, she had seen too much life to carry that around. What she felt now was resolve. The fire was slow but was starting. And while the supervisor pretended to move onto the next file at her desk, she was checking the footage, watching the expression on her own face when she tore the check. Maybe for the first time she saw how careless it had all looked, especially now under scrutiny that grew with each breath. A regional manager from upstairs had been notified. Someone buzzed him after noticing the woman filming and the teens asking questions. He hadn't yet been told the full story, only that a situation was developing in the main lobby involving a repeat customer. Repeat, because Geraldine had been here before, trusted this bank, deposited wedding anniversaries and refund checks here, watched savings grow small here. She had sat across from employees who now avoided her eyes. And through all of it, her face remained calm. But inside, her memory was shaping, carving sharp details she wouldn't forget. Badge names, missed apologies, printed signs of community first, plastered near the teller booths. It was fake kindness on glossy paper. And right behind the teller, on the far end of the glass wall, a poster still stared down. A young woman, smiling, confident in a navy suit, leading tomorrow, today. The face that once belonged to the daughter Geraldine raised on school buses and early morning toast. Her daughter, now big enough in name, wise enough in rooms, trusted enough to represent the very bank tearing up her mother's worth. As the buzz around Geraldine thickened, no one, not security, not staff, not management, had looked closely enough to notice that family resemblance. But someone was about to, and once they did, things would start to fall apart. Not because she yelled or screamed or begged for decency, but because quiet truth, once seen, cannot be ignored. Not again. Not today. Not ever. By the time the second hand on the wall clock ticked past 11:30, the energy inside Metropolitan United Branch had shifted so completely that even those who weren't paying attention could feel something was wrong. The floor wasn't louder, not exactly, but it was heavier. A man standing 3 customers away from the teller had turned fully to face the lobby, his withdrawal slip forgotten in his hand. A young mother paused her conversation on a Bluetooth call and moved to the side, eyes narrowed toward the waiting chairs. Even the branch's usual elevator tune, light jazz flowing from unseen speakers, suddenly felt too bright, too misplaced, too disconnected. Geraldine still hadn't moved. She sat rigid, coat wrapped around her like a shield, with her hands calmly folded up around her purse. The torn pieces of the check pressed against each other within the folds of old leather. Their edges lined up perfectly, but no matter how gently assembled, the cut through her husband's signature could not be undone. Customers nearby had started whispering. They didn't know what was happening. Not completely, but they sensed this wasn't just about money. You could feel the shape of injustice even without full context. and that shape had settled itself across the bank like unwelcome shadow. One man, a middle-aged mechanic with oil still speckled on his work shirt, folded his arms and hovered nearby after he'd finished cashing his paycheck. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed every detail. The posture of the security guard, the unease creeping onto the tellers' faces, and the way no one, not one staff member, had walked over to check on an elderly woman they had just accused of fraud. He'd seen this script before, played out a dozen ways. In grocery stores, parking lots, waiting rooms. But something about this felt worse. Because even now, when the world had upgraded its cameras and slogans, they still expected black people to carry their humiliation like a receipt, filed under "just move on." Except Geraldine didn't. She didn't make a scene. She didn't create a display. And somehow that made everyone else more uneasy. Because the longer she remained still, the more obvious their discomfort became. One of the teenage boys from earlier, the same boy who'd taken the torn check from the waste bin near the counters, motioned to his friend. They sat down across the lobby with a half view of Geraldine and the teller stations. He checked his phone. His cousin, who ran a local community page with over 50,000 followers, was on standby. Already, his phone buzzed with a response. "Keep recording. This feels important." More eyes turned toward the promotional banner high on the wall. Most customers hadn't noticed it before. Not really. It had become part of the wallpaper decor. A familiar smiling face looking out, wearing confidence like perfume. But now that face glowed anew, no longer background. "Leading tomorrow. Today." The banner read beside the photo of a poised young black woman in a tailored blue suit. A child tugged at his mother's coat and pointed up. "She kinda looks like the lady sitting down," he said. People started turning their heads slowly, connecting dots they hadn't noticed earlier. Hairlines, cheekbones, jawlines. It was subtle but unmistakable. The woman in the chair, and the woman on the wall. They shared the same strength behind their stare. One was sitting quietly beside a ruined check. The other was presented as the future of the bank. Somewhere behind the manager's door, the branch's on-duty supervisor finally realized the room had stopped moving. People weren't returning to their phones. Transactions were slowing. Instead of moving forward in line, customers were stepping aside, only half-focused on their reasons for visiting. Even the security guard looked uncertain now. His earlier stance, arms crossed and shadowing the aisle, had shifted. He was now pacing softly and watching reactions instead of enforcing expectations. A couple near the glass exit stopped walking. The man placed a firm hand on the push door but held it there. "Wait," his partner whispered. Back inside, another staff member tried to redirect customers with a forced smile and scripted language, but her words clashed awkwardly with the emotion weaving through the room. There was no rehearing the sound of a check being torn in half. No way to unsee that hurt lingering on Geraldine's face, a woman who had not asked for this spotlight but now sat in its center. One bold customer, a law intern barely 25, pulled out her own phone and began recording. This time not discreetly, and then more followed. 12 seconds. 17. Another woman on TikTok live-streamed. Captions rolled across. "Elder black woman called fraud by tellers after husband's funeral check. They ripped her check. They didn't even verify. Doesn't the woman on the wall look familiar?" She turned the camera to Geraldine and then to the banner behind the counter. Within 10 minutes, the feed had over 2,800 views. By the time someone called up to corporate, it was already too late to make it small again. The story was alive and growing. What the bank hadn't realized, what many institutions often failed to remember, is that quiet humiliation now had 1,000 digital witnesses. And they were building momentum in real time. But Geraldine? She remained seated. The shame others tried to pin on her hadn't stuck. It slid off like water over stone, because she had lived through worse. And in the silent rooms of her life, from hospital beds to protest lines to Sunday church basements, she had learned the most powerful tool one could bring into a storm was stillness. The kind of stillness that exposed noise. The kind of stillness that drew attention to the wrong without ever raising a voice. And now, because she held her ground while they didn't, people were watching. But what's more, Somebody important was watching too. Somewhere in another part of the city, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows and polished desks, a young woman's phone lit up. A clip forwarded from 6 people in under 2 minutes. Her face, glaring back at her from the bank's own campaign banner. Her mother, battered but unbroken, seated underneath it. She blinked hard, because the bank let that happen. To the woman who raised her. The woman they used in echoes and bloodlines to brand their message of progress. And someone soon was about to find out that the face in the poster was not just a symbol. She was power. And unlike the others, her voice was dialed in. The air inside the bank had thickened like fog caught beneath the ceiling lights. Movement slowed, voices hushed, but the tension was loud. Something unseen had broken. Not just paper, not just a rule, but a trust too fragile to name. And just as the silence settled, the room tilted, quietly, in Geraldine's favor. The woman sitting wrapped in wool and worn grace hadn't said a word, but something was shifting around her. A sense that whatever had just taken place wasn't over. That maybe it wasn't even beginning until now. Near the back of the room, the teenage boy, still clutching the torn pension check, held it up next to his phone. He was filming now. Not presenting himself, but bearing witness. The camera framed Geraldine in the foreground, the promotional banner in perfect focus behind her. Same eyes, same shape of the mouth, that unmistakable family resemblance, now undeniable with even a quick glance. The young woman pictured on the banner wasn't just a paid model. She was someone of importance. Her name, printed in the lower corner of the poster, had suddenly caught the attention of several customers glancing upward and then back down at the woman seated in wait. They connected the dots. Same last name, same strength, same quiet steel behind the eyes. Simone Mays. That name meant something. To the bank, it meant progress. Metropolitan United had built entire campaigns around her, promoting a fresh commitment to equality, inclusion, leadership. Simone Mays had risen quickly through the corporate ladder, celebrated as the youngest vice president in the bank's history and the first black woman to lead its national consumer ethics division. Her image had become a face of corporate virtue, a promise printed in ink. But here, in this quiet storm, that promise was showing its cracks. Because sitting below that glossy poster was her mother, Geraldine. Accused, insulted, treated with the same suspicion Simone had been hired to challenge. A second woman in the crowd, dressed in a gray trench with a sharp bob haircut, stood quietly recording now too. She showed no emotion on her face, but her hand was steady. She clipped footage of the teller, the empty manager desk, the silent security guard, and Geraldine's patient stillness. The discrepancy between branding and reality spoke louder than any rant could. In the corporate tower across town, Simone's phone pinged again. Another message, this time from a colleague. "Is this your mom?" No other note, no explanation, just the headline. Simone didn't move at first. She stared at the photograph on her screen, paused mid-livestream, and froze. There was no mistaking the velvet plum coat. No mistaking the lines aging softly beside the eyes she'd kissed goodnight for most of her life. No mistaking the tight fold of the lips Geraldine pressed together when she was holding pain. Within seconds, Simone was dialing. Not to PR. Not to her assistant. She dialed directly into the branch. The phone on the manager's desk rang once. Twice. The assistant manager fumbled to answer, already pale from the weight of what her staff had done. The voice on the other end was measured, calm, but lethal in precision. Simone didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She told them one thing. She was on her way. Back in the branch, Geraldine finally stood. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't meant to threaten. But like the hush before a sermon, it held weight. She smoothed the folds of her dress, reached for the handle of her handbag, took the torn halves of the check from her coat, and laid one piece gently on the armrest of the waiting chair. She kept the other in her palm. No one knew what she meant to do, but everyone kept their eyes on her now. The teller who had dismissed her earlier kept glancing at the back room. He no longer looked confident. His fingers twitched as he tapped them on his tablet, unsure whether to issue apologies or hope no one noticed. A small group of customers had remained near the deposit table, watching, waiting, saying nothing. What had begun as silent observation had now become a low-grade resistance. They weren't leaving, and that was enough to tell the bank their decision was now under public stake. The glass doors opened, and someone noticeable walked in. She wasn't tall. She wasn't dressed for news footage. But the way she moved through the lobby, you knew she didn't belong to the counter. She belonged to the rooms upstairs, the kind with sliding doors and glass-walled meetings. Simone didn't go straight to her mother. She did something else first. With eyes calm and fists clenched around her phone, she walked towards the same teller who had torn the check. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone froze the air. Though she wasn't wearing her name tag or blazer, her face had been on that wall long enough for half the room to recognize her now. A murmur rippled across the floor. That's her. That's the VP. That's the woman they used in the commercials. Customers who had been wary now leaned in with quiet curiosity. All eyes on Simone. Geraldine watched her daughter come nearer, still composed. But her eyes, those usually soft, endlessly proud eyes, glistened now. Not from sadness, but from relief. Not because someone had come to fix it, but because someone now knew. Everything she'd endured, every indignity, every assumption, wasn't just real. It had been seen, and that changed everything. The supervisor was suddenly back on the floor now. Nervous, fidgeting, unsure of what to say. She tried to offer an explanation, but Simone didn't engage. Her silence cut deeper than rejection. She bypassed them effortlessly, walking directly to her mother and tucking her hand inside hers. A brief pause passed, the kind thick with meaning. Simone wrapped one arm around Geraldine's shoulder and turned her to the exit. They walked out together. But the story didn't stop at the door. It had just begun. Because the videos had gone out. The story had started running its course. And Metropolitan United would no longer be able to hide behind their slogans when the very woman whose image powered their reputation had now become the face of their hypocrisy. And Geraldine? She didn't need revenge. She already had something more powerful. Something no one could tear down. A daughter holding the pen. And the truth stepping into the light. The morning after the storm, everything looked the same. The bank's beige walls stood unbothered. The posters still waved their polished promises, and the double glass doors opened with their familiar whoosh to a mostly unaware midday crowd. From the outside, it was just another corner branch, steady and unchanged. But inside Metropolitan United's headquarters, neither the silence nor the stillness could mask the reality that something permanent had cracked. And that fracture, though small, was widening fast. What started as a moment of mistreatment, a check torn in half, an elderly woman dismissed, had grown into something their PR team could no longer contain. The video clips, stitched together online by strangers who had borne witness, had already spread across platforms. A woman in D.C. shared it with a caption. Her daughter's face was on the wall when they accused her of fraud. An investment journalist picked it up next. Metropolitan VP's mother, humiliated by own bank. This isn't optics, it's architecture. By noon the following day, the name Geraldine Mays had been stamped across news feeds, hashtags, and morning talk show rundowns. But the face everyone knew already belonged to someone else. Simone. The bank had used her story. Not just her face, but her narrative. Simone Mays, first-generation college graduate. Simone Mays, once the intern nobody believed in. Simone Mays, the youngest black woman to hold executive position at the national level. She's proof our values work, they'd said. They gave her the spotlight. They filled their promotional campaigns with buzzwords people like to attach to progress. Inclusive, modern, visionary. She'd even been flown out to speak on behalf of the company at panels about workplace equity, used as a proof point sliding neatly between a sea of well-meaning bullet points and carefully managed applause. But yesterday proved something none of those brand campaigns could fix. You could preach progress. You could print diversity. But if the mother of your most celebrated leader could be tossed aside like a scammer at the teller line, what was all that glass-polished branding? Simone knew the board would meet without her that morning. She let them. She wasn't interested in watching executives panic in circles, replaying footage on loop, offering statements that felt more like damage control than remorse. Instead, she sat in her own quiet room, her phone face down, her blazer folded across the chair. Before her laptop even blinked alive, she already knew what needed to come next. She opened a document labeled Internal Policy Audit, Discretionary Treatment Notes. It was one she had flagged before, buried under low priority tags. Always something we should revisit soon. But now, soon had arrived. Geraldine hadn't asked for this. That was what haunted Simone most. Her mother hadn't sought fame, pity, or attention. She only wanted to access her husband's final contribution to a life spent grounded in work, family, and dignity. She had walked into that bank entirely alone, and left with the eyes of the world at her back. The most painful thing wasn't the torn check. It wasn't even the fact that her coworkers had failed to recognize the mother of the very woman they called a symbol of inclusion. It was that they hadn't needed to know her name to treat her better. They should have treated every customer with the humanity her mother had been so cruelly denied. That was the real wound. The morning passed slowly, and by afternoon, Simone's name was now a trend. Industry leaders tagged her in messages pledging support. Colleagues she hadn't heard from in years sent thin words like, "Unbelievable," and "Let us know how to help." But Simone wasn't waiting for sympathy. She carried a different urgency now. She prepared a statement, one not routed through PR. No soft coding or passive tone. It wasn't directed to the news or the market, but to the people inside the bank who had grown too comfortable with their roles, too numb to their bias. She wrote plainly, but firmly. It wasn't anger or emotion that shaped her words. It was love. Love for a woman who never asked for a platform but had just reshaped the one Simone stood on. The statement went live on the bank's internal staff portal at 4:03 p.m. Within it, she detailed every part of the incident. The failure in judgment. The lack of protocol. The inhumanity dressed up as routine. She ended it with a mandate, one drafted with her mother's silence ringing between each line. Effective immediately, the following changes would begin. Every report of suspected fraud involving seniors over 65 would be flagged at the regional level and reviewed within 24 hours for potential bias signals. New teller onboarding would include bias immersion and empathy training, taught not through bullet points but through real case studies, including her mother's. No staff member would be allowed to serve behind the counter without first attending a customer dignity seminar led by people from their own communities. Finally, every promotional campaign bearing a face would be publicly paired with a commitment. No more smiles without systems to justify them. Simone didn't release the statement to the press. Her press was already watching. The moment it hit inboxes, staff began talking. Not quietly, not defensively, but with sudden unease. In break rooms and private chats, tellers and associates whispered the words aloud. Geraldine was her mother. And just like that, the hierarchy flipped. The face on the banner was no longer just the voice of change. She was the witness of their failure. And Geraldine? She sat at home, feet up, slippers old and comfortable. Her landline had rung more times that day than it had in a month. Church friends, neighbors, journalists, though she hadn't returned a single one. She'd canceled all media requests. She didn't need to speak. Her daughter already had. And as the sun dipped low that evening, a copy of the new policy draft arrived by email. Simone hadn't sent it with any note, just the subject line, "For you." Geraldine opened it slow and quiet. She read each line carefully, at the small table where her husband used to drink his coffee. The same wood where she had once laid bills and birthday cards, pension papers and torn checks. But this time, the page before her was different. It wasn't an apology. It was action. And somewhere beneath its sharp, simple lettering, the last laugh hummed softly inside her chest. Not bitter, not loud, but deeply, truthfully earned. It began quietly, the way change often does, not with a fire, but with a flicker. 2 days after Simone's internal statement was released, there was a tremble in the tone of morning meetings. Not a panic, not quite yet, but a tightening breath behind every smile. every forced greeting inside the halls of Metropolitan United. Staff had read the message. Whether they agreed or not didn't matter now. The story had gone beyond memory. It had entered consequence. Senior leadership scheduled an all-hands emergency meeting, the first of its kind since the global downturn 6 years ago. This time, the financials weren't the crisis. It was integrity. It was image. And it was something even harder to repair. Trust broken. The clips wouldn't die down. Online, they only multiplied. From viral news outlets to equity forums, people were stitching together parts of Geraldine's story with alarming consistency. What people couldn't look away from wasn't just the injustice. It was the irony. A bank praised for its diversity had quietly disrespected the very root of the woman they had raised to climb their ranks. The weight of that contradiction didn't disappear. It swelled. Board members, once distant from operational matters, were now being pulled into furious email chains and public calls for accountability. Industry partners asked questions during conference calls that used to start with, "How's quarterly growth?" but now opened with, "How are you handling the incident?" No one had to say which incident. By now, the whole world knew. The head of customer relations stepped down quietly. He cited family reasons in his email, but his staff knew better. His department had failed to create the safety net that might have caught Geraldine before her check met scissors and suspicion. Janet, the supervisor who gave the go-ahead to reject the deposit, was first placed on leave and then released the following week. Her history was reviewed by HR, who found no active patterns, but they found something else. Silence. Notes left unfiled. Complaints left undecided. Reminders that doing nothing can be as loud as doing wrong. The teller, Marcus, had vanished. Asked not to return before an investigation concluded. His name no longer appeared on the shift schedule. Some said he moved to another city. Others thought he'd lawyered up. But to most staff, he became a fable. A reminder that perception of power, when misused, carries longer shadows than expected. Yet it wasn't just about individuals anymore. What loomed now was systemic. Local advocacy groups began organizing outside the branch where it had all occurred. They didn't carry torches or anger. They carried lawn chairs, clipboards, and cups of coffee. They offered pamphlets on financial literacy and criminalized banking practices. Their signs were simple: respect our elders. We are not suspicious by default. Who gets to decide what trust looks like? Inside the branch, the windows stayed shut under drawn blinds. Simone watched it all unfold not from afar, but from the center of the storm. She attended meetings with the national board she was part of, listened to their discussions, heard their discomfort. They asked her to stay neutral. Neutral. That word lingered like sour air in her lungs. She had been neutral for 6 years. Smiling, proving, navigating, explaining why her presence mattered without daring to name what invisibility felt like. But now it was personal. Because the bank hadn't just disrespected a customer. They'd made it clear that their policies weren't built to see people, only policies. So Simone pushed new measures forward. Not reforms scribbled on paper and buried in bureaucracy, but real-time strategies. Sweeping process evaluations of how senior citizens were treated. Mandatory audits of every fraud intervention case sorted by race and age. Numbers no one had wanted to look at, but she forced into the light. The data stung. In 18 months, of all people flagged for unusual behavior when depositing a check over $2,000, nearly 64% were Black customers over the age of 55. The rate at which they were denied or stalled compared to their white counterparts. Nearly 3 to 1. The numbers told a story no PR campaign could rewrite. And Simone made sure they didn't. She brought in third-party equity firms. She redirected the internal DEI budget into creating a bias response unit, staffed with people outside the company, answerable to the public, not hidden behind lobbying interests. The response shook the institution to its core. Longtime employees complained that the culture was changing too fast. Others quietly requested transfers. But the newer employees, the quiet ones in the back who'd watched for years, began to rise. They felt emboldened. They spoke more clearly. They shared their truths in team huddles they once remained silent in. One young hire, Adrian, told her team how her mother had stopped going to banks altogether years ago after being accused of passing a washed check from a family trust. No apology ever came. That story sat in her bones until Geraldine's showed the world it was never isolated. Emotions ran deep, but it was in that unraveling that something else finally emerged: reckoning. Workshops were introduced not as checkboxes, but as survival ethics. Staff were told not to memorize phrases but to confront their assumptions. One session asked employees to walk into a room marked with scenarios and choose which ones they would question, which they would accept. 75-year-old woman, depositing a pension check. 32-year-old man, cashing a tax refund. Teenager, carrying a real estate closing document. Each decision was followed up with camera footage. Each face was anonymous. Then names were revealed. Then races. Then real outcomes. Some couldn't look. It wasn't shaming. It was witnessing. Geraldine's story lived in every module now. Her stillness, her poise, her gentleness, her pain. It had traveled past the walls of that branch and become a lantern, held up to whatever slept in the dark, shaking institutions out of comfort. Geraldine herself remained quiet as change wrapped around her. She declined interviews. She waved away the glamour of becoming an icon. She clipped coupons. She attended Sunday service. She read the letters Simone brought home, quiet thank you notes from strangers who had seen the video and wept. From women who had endured the same silent shred of their dignity. From sons who said, "That could have been my mom." From young tellers in small towns, inspired to speak up. Geraldine read each one slowly, then folded them carefully, stored in a shoebox wrapped with ribbon. Not out of vanity, but out of honor. Those words could have arrived years ago in another lifetime, but instead, they arrived now, rushed in by a torn check and a history tired of repeating itself. Justice rarely comes gift-wrapped. Sometimes it arrives in pieces, waiting for someone brave enough to hold them steady until the world is ready to look. And this time, the world had no choice but to see. The wind felt different outside Metropolitan United's headquarters. A little lighter, a little cleaner, though nothing had truly changed in the air. Still, for the first time in a long time, something felt cleared out. Not erased, but aired. Inside, work continued. Screens flashed with spreadsheets. Elevators hummed without apology. Suits passed with coffee and quiet intent. But beneath it all, something had broken open. And from that fracture, a new truth had made its way through every floor. It had been 4 months since Geraldine Mays walked out of the bank with her daughter's hand tucked into hers. For months since a check meant for warmth and groceries and peace had been sliced in two. For months since the world paused and watched. The reaction had started big, loud, viral. But the quieter aftermath is always where real legacy lives. After the headlines faded, what remained was policy, structure, cultural ribs rebuilt, one truth at a time. It began with an email from the CEO himself. Not a templated apology. Not regret about the incident. It was an admission. The institution had failed. Not just that day, but for many days before it. He admitted they wore progress like a suit, but hadn't always folded it around the core of every customer. Following Simone's internal reforms, larger shifts took hold. Metropolitan United did something few banks had ever done before. They opened the doors. Independent equity auditors were given unrestricted access. Over 24 community leaders, pastors, educators, union organizers, retired postal workers were invited into strategy sessions. They didn't come to clap. They came to critique. And they were heard. Geraldine declined the bank's offer to chair the new ethics board. Not out of spite, but purpose. They didn't need her in meetings. They needed her story in memory. In training rooms, in the small places where policies trickled into real human action. So instead, she agreed to lend her name. The Mays Standard became the first customer-first directive written by a committee of elders, community leaders, and historians. It outlined not just what to do, but how to see, how to humanize a name on a check, how to respond when the system itself causes harm, how to sit across from someone and ask, "Do I see you? Or do I see a threat?" It was powerful because it was simple, because it was hers. Simone watched from within as her mother's legacy crystallized not in statements, but in systems. The woman who once dressed her wounds after schoolyard taunts was now closing national gaps in customer dignity. Every new teller walked into 40 hours of redesigned onboarding. Not just on operations, but on humanity. Geraldine's story was in the modules. Her image, not glamorized, not softened, played on screen as she recounted what happened. Not just for empathy's sake, but clarity. Her tone in that footage was never angry. It was steady, like the banks they claimed to be. And in offering steady truth, she pressed change into motion without shouting. That became part of the message itself. Not every revolution is loud. Some sit in chairs and wait. Some breathe instead of argue. Some let the room feel its own discomfort without diffusing it. Geraldine showed them how. Outside the bank, other institutions began calling. Healthcare networks, airlines, universities. They asked for guidance, offered to license training, to consult with Simone, to understand what it meant to rebuild trust. Not through branding but foundation. It wasn't about image now. It was about infrastructure. Across town, in the neighborhood where Geraldine lived, something small and beautiful happened too. The local credit union, one of the few black-owned financial institutions that had been quietly serving the community since the 60s, renamed their financial literacy center, the Maze Resource Room. Children came there after school now, learning how to read a bank statement, how to open a savings account, how to protect their elders and learn from them. Geraldine didn't ask for that either, but she did stand at the ribbon cutting in her plum coat, her church hat held gentle in her hands, her smile warm and lasting. She spoke only briefly. The crowd didn't need a speech. They just needed to see the woman, who had once been mistaken for a criminal inside a bank she helped inspire, and now stood tall in honor within a bank that had always seen her right. Simone kept working. Beyond the spotlight, beyond the interviews, beyond the panels where moderators called her trailblazer, she pushed deeper reforms. She funded scholarships in her mother's name, created grants for financial equity research, built consulting arms designed not just to teach institutions, but to teach people within them how to unlearn what they'd been taught about who deserved access, grace, and patience. But what mattered most to Simone came on a Tuesday morning she almost forgot to check email. A message from a junior teller, just 3 weeks into the job, popped into her inbox. No subject line, just a few sentences. I served a woman today who reminded me of someone. She was nervous. She had her documents stacked so perfectly. Normally I might have asked her why she needed to deposit in person. But I stopped myself. I remembered her story. Your mother's story. I asked her how her day was going instead. I saw her smile. Simone stared at the screen for a long while, her eyes soft, the coffee beside her untouched. That's all it was. No certificate, no campaign. Just one woman reminding another that she mattered. That's how all of this began. And it's how all real change continues. Back at Geraldine's house, a new heater hummed quietly through the walls. An oversized envelope containing a ceremonial copy of her husband's reissued check sat unopened on the mantel. She hadn't needed it completed to feel whole. She had never asked for apologies or reparations. All she ever wanted was to be seen and respected. And now she was, all across America, people had caught a glimpse of a larger truth through one woman's quiet pain. And that truth, once visible, had shaped more than one moment. It reshaped a movement. Geraldine never became a symbol because she tried. She became one because dignity, once placed in the open, refuses to go ignored again. And for everyone who watched that first clip, who felt their own story echoed in her silence, you too are part of this. Your voice, your story, your stand. Every quiet resistance matters. If this journey moved you, hit that subscribe button. Share the story, and tell us where you were the moment things shifted. Because the next chapter might just be yours.